So we're looking at Luke chapter 20. And as we go into Luke chapter 20, the first thing we get is the authority of Jesus gets questioned by the chief priests, by the Pharisees, by the teachers of the law. And they're saying, tell us by what authority you do these things, which presumably means by the authority by which you preach, teach, and do healing, miracles, deliverances, and all that sort of stuff. Interestingly, we have this whole obsession about authority sometimes. And actually, it's all about human authority. It's about who's in charge here. Who's in charge here? And people want you to be linked into this group or linked in with that or affiliated to this or affiliated to that or be overseen by whatever. But interestingly, I often think that our paranoia with hierarchy is actually much more about control than it is actually about Christ-like obedience. Interestingly, Jesus talks about his authority isn't a human authority. It's not like in the Church of England you get a license. And I often wonder, you get a license from the bishop, but you also think, well, bishop's just a person who's trying to follow God. Well, some more seriously than others, but I'm very fortunate to have a good bishop in Bristol who I knew was really trying to faithfully follow Jesus. But you're like, well, they're a person. Yeah, accountability is good. But ultimately, the highest accountability I have, any of us have, is before Jesus. Actually, our authority doesn't come from a bit of paper from a bishop or from our church leader saying, oh, yeah, go and do that. Good though these things are, and it's good to have clear lines of transparency and people to be able to speak into our lives and give us wise and good advice. Our authority actually comes from not what bits of paper we have, but from who we are, that we are sons and daughters of the living God. We are people filled with God's Spirit. We are people seeking to be obedient to the call of God. Our authority comes from Jesus, who died and rose again. Jesus' authority comes, first of all, for he was called. He was called by God, and God sent Jesus for such a time as this. But Jesus also knew his identity. Right at the start of his ministry, before he'd done any miraculous signs or preached any great sermons, as far as we can tell, Jesus said, and God said, this is my own dear son, with whom I am well pleased. He was validated before the start of his ministry. It wasn't about what he did, it was about who he was. He was God's son, with whom God was well pleased. And actually, who are we? We are people that are children of God. We're children of God. That's how our identity is, and that's where our authority comes from. Yet so often in churches and in life, we feel like somebody somewhere ought to give us permission to do stuff. And actually, we sort of often feel quite tentative, thinking, it can't be me being called to do this. I can't be called to do that. Feeling like somebody who's properly important ought to do this job or do that job. But I'd say if you've got a passion for something, if you feel God's raising something in your heart, do chat to wise and godly Christians. Do get people around you to pray and make sure you're doing things in a godly, right and transparent way. But ultimately, our authority to Jesus, our authority comes from being obedient to Jesus. Our authority comes from who we are and our relationship with knowing that we are God's sons and daughters. Interestingly, Jesus it sort of ends up playing with these guys a little bit by saying Jesus' authority, humanly speaking, came because he was endorsed and validated by John the Baptist. And that John the Baptist was a little bit like some of the Old Testament prophets, speaking amazing godly truth, but yet sometimes not doing it within the institution. The institution sometimes becomes so sort of self-occupied, so sort of self-preserving, that actually obedience and truth and faith and authenticity sometimes are lost in favor of keeping the show on the road, holding the party line, doing that which we're told, doing that which we're supposed to do. And so Jesus said, John's baptism, which is by which Jesus got commissioned, John's baptism, from heaven or not? Although the priests and the teachers of the law wouldn't want to say that John's baptism was from God, they knew also that John was immensely popular with ordinary people, of whom they didn't want to wind up. Interestingly, it says of Jesus and his preaching, he spoke as one with authority. I reckon the reason why they're mean about Jesus is because they're jealous of him. We want what you've got, to be able to speak with authority, rather than this sort of, I'm not quite sure, but I'm really into the power thing that seemed to be very much how they live their lives. Anyway, Jesus then tells a story that really winds up the Orthodox guys there, the chief priests and leaders of the temple, and it's almost like a picture of the dawn of time going straight to almost the cross. Really, it talks about a farmer, a man planting a vineyard, rented it to some farmers, and wanted some of his grapes. And yet he first sends a servant who gets beaten up, then another servant who also gets beaten up and treated shamefully, and are both sent away empty-handed, and then a third, and they wound him and threw him out. So the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my son, whom I love, and perhaps they will send him." When the tenants saw him, they talked over this matter. "This is the heir," they said. "Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they threw him out the vineyard and killed him. A picture, actually, of the prophets and the various people that God has called up over the years to keep on calling the people of God back to him. And now Jesus has come, the Messiah has come, the Son of God has come. And the chief priests and the leaders of the temple are planning his murder, his assassination, if you like. And they know what's in their hearts. They know that Jesus is telling them this story as an attack, as a challenge. Jesus then says this: "What then will the owner do? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyards to others." Again, scary images that I don't really like Jesus saying, but it's there in the text, and so it's a bit of a challenge. Jesus is saying there will come a reckoning, and actually the question will be, what did you do with the Son? What did you do about Jesus? What do you think about Jesus? Interestingly, there's a story, I think it's quite a powerful story. It appears in one of the Youth Alpha videos of a man who had a massive art collection, loads of chateaus, lots of money, and he died leaving a will, but no one knew quite what the will said. But they knew there was going to be an auction, and everyone came wanting to pick up a bargain because he had a great many valuable and amazing things. And this great man had a son, but sadly his son had died. And the first picture was a painting of that son. And an old gardener who was part of the family, who was a servant in the family, bidded a small amount for it. It was about £5 or something. It wasn't a posh painting, because he knew the son and he loved the son and he wanted the picture of the son. So he bid £5 for the first lot, and no one else did. So he got the picture, and then he was told that the auction was over. This gardener had got everything, and he said, "Well, I don't understand." And the will very simply said, "Whoever wants my son has my entire inheritance. Whoever wants my son has my entire inheritance." I kind of, that kind of picture just slightly blew my mind, that idea that it's all about Jesus. And God saying, if you get Jesus, all this is yours too. All this is yours too. It then also talks about the stone that the builder rejected has become a cornerstone. And I was thinking about that picture, that so often people look at Jesus and they don't see who he is or quite what he's got to offer them. And actually, we don't see the purity of the pearl. We don't see why Jesus matters so much. And actually, what we need to do as Christians and those who aren't Christians is pray that we see Jesus as he really is, that actually when we see Jesus as he is, we're not going to reject him, but to say, yeah, you make sense of life and I want to follow you. Often we hear and we talk to people and we realize that human beings are very bad or very good, depending which way you look at it, at rejecting people, about not seeing people's worth or potential or value. And yet God says, they're mine and they're full of value and potential and worth. He says that about you too, and me too, even though I rarely feel it. But he says, actually, you are precious and honored in my sight. The chief priests looked for a way to arrest him immediately because they knew he'd spoken this parable against them. This is Jesus fighting back. I bet they felt really uncomfortable. So they spent spies and pretended to be sincere. Luke doesn't pull his punches, does he? They hoped to catch Jesus in something he said, that they might be able to hand him over to the power and authority of the governor. So the spies questioned him. Teacher, you know that you speak and teach what is right, and that you do not show partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Therefore, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? They think they're being very clever, because if Jesus had said, of course it isn't, the Jews would love him and the Romans would hate him and arrest him. And if he said, no, pay your taxes, lots of the Jews would hate him and the Romans wouldn't be that bothered about him. But Jesus saw their duplicity and said, show me a denarii, and whose image and inscription is on it? Caesar's, they replied. And he said to them, well, then give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God. Interestingly, this picture that actually Caesar's coin is made from copper or whatever metal it is that's dug out of the ground, the earth that was made by the Lord, from a substance that's been made by him, maybe shaped and fashioned by humans to be how it is. And each one of these coins would look exactly the same as the last, almost like a cookie cutter. Whereas God in his creation and infinite glory, beauty and majesty creates every single thing unique, bespoke and different. Yeah, you probably do have to pay Caesar some taxes. You probably do have to pay what you owe. You probably do have to make some contribution to the state. But actually, God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. It's all God's. Giving to Caesar what's Caesar's, yeah, you might have to do it, but they're not, it's not even the same league or same race. Yeah, fulfill your obligations, but remember, give to God what is God. I owe God absolutely everything. Every breath I take and every beat of my heart is at the grace of God. We live and breathe and have our being in him, in Jesus. He is the one that makes sense of it all. And so they're silenced. And then we get this long passage, or reasonably long passage, about marriage and the resurrection, where some Sadducees who don't believe in resurrection, I was told quite a good way of remembering it is, because they don't believe in the resurrection, they're sad, you see. Yeah, it's a bit of a cheesy one, but it helps you remember. And they said about this strange rule that appears in the Bible about if a brother dies and leaves a wife with no children, then the next man must marry the widow, and so on, so that the widow has children and is protected and is safe. And it talks about having, 3, 4, 5, 7 who have died. And then the woman dies too. And then they say, so then on the resurrection, whose wife will she be, since 7 were married to her? And Jesus replied, people of this age marry and get given in marriage, and those who consider you worthy taking part in it and come into the resurrection from the dead will neither marry or be given in marriage, for they no longer can die. They're like the angels. And I was thinking about that. I've often thought, that seems a bit odd, really, whether you're married or not married, or how does it all work. But I'm not saying that you won't be seeing people you love again, or being or connecting again deeply and lovingly. But I was thinking the premise of this question is, who does she belong to? The wife, the widow. And Jesus is saying, actually, in heaven, she is free. Moses had this law that was trying to protect widows who are often ill-treated and vulnerable, and saying they needed to be given protection and being provided for and looked after, and the family had a responsibility for her even if her husband died. The family that she'd been married into needed to look after her and her children and make sure she was okay. But actually in heaven, that's not a duty that has to happen. In heaven, she will be okay. And she's not going to be defined by who her husband is or what family she came from. You know, heaven isn't about us owning or having those relationships with other people that define them. In heaven, you are you because you are you because you are you. And actually this idea that you are defined by being someone's dad, mum, wife, or whatever, that's not your true or primary identity. Who you are is a beloved child of God. They are God's children since they are children of the resurrection. Paul says in verse 30. Luke says in verse 36. Then Jesus says that God is the God of the living and not the dead, God of Isaac and Jacob. The idea that actually the resurrection is at the heart of what the Christian faith is. He doesn't dispute the resurrection at all. He's definitely more on the Pharisee than Sadducee line, because the Pharisees believed in resurrection and in angels and in the supernatural. And Jesus is clearly stating his views that heaven is a real living place. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. For him, all are alive. Jesus is saying that resurrection is happening. In fact, the resurrection changes everything. It changes everything. Because if people rise from the dead, there is hope and a future. And the only person that fully rose from the dead, not just to resuscitation, not just living for a bit longer before dying again, was Jesus. The resurrection is about to happen by the first fruits of the resurrection just happening. And this resurrection image is happening just before the crucifixion is about to take place. We are meant to think of both resurrection and death in the run-up of this chapter. Then there's this question, whose son is the Messiah? And we realize that David, the great king, the greatest king, calls Jesus Lord. And I was thinking about that. What authority does Jesus have? Well, the Bible says that all authority has been given to him. All authority has been given to him. And he sends us out and he commissions us. Again, at Matthew 28. But then I thought that at the name of Jesus, every knee must bow in heaven, on earth, and under the earth, and every voice confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. King David says of Jesus, my Lord, my Lord. So at the name of Jesus, his authority is because he is God incarnate. He is the one and only. He is God made flesh, God walking in human life and dignity. The God of the living, the God who changes it all, the God who resurrects. And then the passage ends with the unscrupulous nature of the Pharisees. They exploit and devour the widow, which ties in with our next passage. We can't stop reading there. Imagine this passage ends, well, it shouldn't end there. It should end a little bit earlier. But imagine this passage ends with ... The religious people devour women's houses for show and make lengthy prayers. They will be punished most severely ...